Yesterday, we talked with a retired Air Force colonel about vaccine mandates on members of the military. And now that he was retired, Mark Hurley able to talk about his experience. Well, I followed up with the Illinois National Guard, number one, to get confirmation of Hurley's tenure, but also to find out the status of the nation's vaccine mandate and how it's impacting National Guard soldiers. Good morning. It is Springfield's Morning News. I'm Greg Bishop on 92.7 WMAY, Springfield's News and Talk. And it looks like, number one, the National Guard confirming Mark Hurley was a retired colonel. He's been in some form of service since 1985, I believe. But the National Guard also confirming that they received guidance on rescinding the COVID-19 vaccine mandate. So on Friday, the U.S. Department of Defense sending out to the Illinois National Guard that guidance to rescission of the COVID-19 vaccine mandate. And if you remember, that was something that President Joe Biden in 2021 had said that he's not going to do. He didn't have an interest in mandating the vaccine. And then you had all of the, incentives of free cheeseburgers and French fries or free donuts or free beer or, a shot and a shot. You remember all of that. But then quickly turned on a dime and turned into mandates with vaccine passports to be able to get into entertainment venues in Chicago. Turned into having to check with, customs and show your vaccine passports before you can come into the country, and a whole host of vaccine mandates, including by Governor J.B. Pritzker, on K through 12 staff, on college students and staff, on prison guards, and then you had the governors and the president mandate it for members of the military. Well, at the tail end of last year and the beginning of this year, you had the rescission of that mandate put into federal law, and the Department of Defense just now sending that out to National Guard. So the Illinois National Guard said they just received that guidance to implement the rescission of the 2021 COVID-19 vaccine requirement. The service components, the Army and Air Force, have until March 17th to certify that these actions have been completed. So you got some of the statement here from the DoD saying that the heads to formally rescind any policies, directives, and guidance implementing those vaccine mandates as soon as possible. If they're not already done so, the DoD statement said, department leadership remains committed to ensuring the safety of our service members and will continue to promote and encourage vaccinations for all service members along with continued use of effective mitigation measures. Now, this, of course, as you've got a whole bunch of headlines that have happened in the past 48, 72 hours or so of the origins of COVID-19 and how the Department of Energy has intelligence indicating it's may have come from a lab out of Wuhan, China. You've got that speculation even, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, even before that, in 2019, some cables, international intelligence cables, indicating that, according to reporting, that there was something going on around Wuhan and possible leak of some kind of pathogen from a lab. So, the fact that they would, number one, say it was conspiracy theory to even ask, did this come from a lab? That promulgated mainstream corporate media for months on end, labeling anybody who raised that as a possibility as a racist. Well, now we, of course, saw the Facebook and Twitters of the world reversing their censorship of those questions. And then here we are now. Of course, Jon Stewart made jokes about it. Other comedians making jokes about how obviously this came from a lab. And now the Department of Energy over the weekend telling some big newspapers that they have the intelligence. But the Biden administration still saying, no, it's not definitive yet. So we'll see how far that goes. But really, the COVID situation leading to these vaccine mandates for people who wanted to have a livelihood. We also find out in the past couple of weeks here that Dr. Anthony Fauci, of all people, recognized that the COVID-19 vaccine was not as effective as it was sold to be. So we have the vaccine mandates based off of a vaccine that's not effective to stop a virus that possibly came from a lab out of China. It's pretty incredible. We talked with Mark Hurley. He is the retired Air Force colonel who shared with us some of his experience. And with the vaccine mandate being rescinded, he wanted to make sure that there were a couple of things that were part of the conversation here. And in particular, making sure that, number one, that individuals who were harmed by this are made whole. And number two, to reflect on the readiness issues that were raised in all of this, because the readiness issues, you want your military to be ready. And when you're imposing these vaccine mandates on what was seen as an experimental vaccine with the mRNA, new technology used for wholesale vaccines, Hurley said he was suspicious right off the get-go and was worried about the readiness issues. Here's some of our conversation from yesterday.
I saw a study by Lieutenant Colonel Teresa Long, who was not only an MD, she was an immunologist, and she was in charge of an aviation unit. She filed an affidavit. And when I read the affidavit, roughly, as I recall, 20% of her aviation unit could no longer fly. Wow. Okay, so that made it a problem, particularly for the Air Force, right? If you run into the same situation, and particularly when it was affecting, 20 to 40-year-olds, right? So you knew you had a problem. That then leads into all sorts of readiness issues. And if you know anything about the National Guard and the reserves, we have to recruit basically 15% every year. So it's a new 15% because people retire, they get promoted, they get new jobs, that whole thing. And if you add to it folks who refuse to take the vaccine, that's another 10% drop. And then on top of that, what we didn't expect is people getting sick from the vaccine. So that's an additional drop. Okay, so that's why we're facing so many readiness issues now. We knew all this 18 months ago, right? We knew this was going to happen, but we couldn't react quickly enough because at one point President Biden said, it's not going to be mandatory. And then 3 months later, he said, it's mandatory for the military. Well, I was extremely grateful, basically, to Speaker McCarthy and to a lot of the Freedom Caucus and to other members of Congress who actually changed the National Defense Authorization Act last fall that would have eliminated the vaccine mandate among the military members, because they were able to continue a fight that I could no longer continue because I, had retired. I always followed my chain of command, right? I'm very respectful and very honorable profession, and I always followed my chain of command. Once I was retired, I could work outside the chain of command, and that's when I went to Congresswoman Mary Miller, and she did a phenomenal job communicating to the Freedom Caucus and to the other members of her caucus. So she invited me out to the State of the Union, and that's when I went out, thanked Speaker McCarthy personally, actually talked at a reception with a number of just different congressmen, and they all said to the person, we have to figure out how to reinstate those that were pushed out of the military. And so that's really what's prompting this discussion, is how do we do that? Because you have to have good order and discipline in the military. And so, that there are some people that were hurt financially, right? They were pushed out and they were off of work for 2 months and then they found another job, sure, right? Or maybe they were making $50,000 a year, but they could only find a job that paid $25,000, right? So the first thing is you have to figure out how to pay that gap. The second thing is you have to make sure how their careers won't be hurt because they didn't follow an order, okay? And then the third part of that is, okay, once we do that, do you really want to force them back into the same organizations that they came from with the same leadership, because they already don't have a trust for that leadership? And that's an issue. It's a very predominant issue. So there needs to be a mechanism where they can actually move into an organization, get spun up again, because if they've been out for a year, they're going to have to do all sorts of retraining. You can't just hop into a F-16 again, right, without getting back up to speed, and we're very high tech in the Air Force.
So again, that's Mark Hurley, a retired Air Force colonel, talking about the things he wants to make sure is a focus now that the vaccine mandate for the COVID-19 vaccine is being rescinded from being mandated on active duty service members, including the Illinois National Guard, which told me yesterday they just received the guidance to rescind the COVID-19 vaccine mandates. Stay tuned. We'll hear a little bit more about the issue of the lab leak theory. That's up next here on WMAY. Been talking about COVID-19 and the vaccine mandates, but there's also the news of the vaccine not being as effective as they sold it to be. That's according to some recent reporting about Anthony Fauci filings. But you also have the origin of COVID-19, where the Biden administration says there's no consensus. Here's John Kirby answering questions of reporters this past 24 hours or so.
The president made trying to find the origins of COVID a priority right when he came into office. And he's got a whole of government effort designed to do that. There is not a consensus right now.
So no consensus right now, as the Department of Energy apparently says there's some indication of that. And senators in the U.S. Congress looking to declassify assessments of where COVID-19 came from. It's 7 o'clock.
From the Fly SPI studio.